Good morning. It's great to see it. It's good to see all you guys here this morning, too. It's great to see everyone here who's gathered in person, and also welcome to everyone who is joining us and participating with us online as we continue to read Titus together. Before we do, this time last week, I was standing here with my phone in my hand, awaiting news on my wife who had had surgery the previous Friday overnight, and just to let you know, she is home watching, doing much, much better, improving every day, and just really appreciate all the thoughts and prayers and people reaching out. We're always super blessed to be part of a community that's just so supportive and through everything, but especially when something happens, you have to kind of deal with that. So we are super grateful for that. This morning, as we're going to read Titus 2. If you follow along, I posted a video kind of instructions on how to read Titus that we're going to do this week, and we're going to read Titus 2. Looking for some specific things, I just ask you to consider like how you would read. What do you observe when you read Titus chapter 2? And a lot of us, I've grown up reading the Bible for most of my life, and especially being someone who keeps a journal. I love lists. When it says love is patient and kind, not jealous, and it does not envy, I love that because I get to write down a list of things. Love is not patient, love is not patient. Love is patient, love is kind, is not jealous. When I write, when it says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I love that. It's good to write that out. So I like lists. I like when the instructions are clear. And a lot of us read the Bible like we're trying to put together a gas grill or something, or a piece of furniture from IKEA. It's like, let me get the instructions out, let me lay them out, let me look at it. For those of you who read instructions, the rest of you, I can't really help you. But you open it up and you read it and you look at it, and then it tells you step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And if you do all these steps, voila, it bears the image that's on the front of the box. And a lot of us read the Bible like that. We read the Bible like if we just follow these instructions, we're going to turn out like we're supposed to. But we're not invited really into a checklist. We're not invited to observe a bunch of checklists of rules or regulations to follow. Instead, what we encounter is a narrative, an account of God's interaction with his people. If you were been here a few weeks ago or watched the conversation that Clay led with myself and Laura Lynn and Courtney, we talked about how we read the Bible and why we read the Bible and why it's so intimidating. And we said there's really a couple of things. Primarily, I read the Bible, and the reason we use it as a church is because it tells us who God is, and it tells us how God is. We get insight into who this God that created us and has called us is. We also get really tremendous insight into how he operates, what he does, what he allows, what he doesn't allow, what he intends, what he doesn't intend. But it also takes work, because he didn't just give us like a list or some clear instructions. He often uses poems, and he uses interactions, and sometimes he uses stories that are baffling and stories that are bad, stories that don't seem to make sense to us. And we have to do a lot of work to kind of enter into this. It's living and it's active and invites us in. And if you remember last week, we started with Titus chapter 1. Titus is a letter. It's written from a guy named Paul, who was basically largely responsible for spreading the gospel around the world in the first century. It's the reason that most of us are where we are today, and what we understand about the gospel is because of Paul's missionary journeys in the first century throughout the world that just rippled out and has really transformed everything that we know about the world from Paul's writings and teachings and what he taught specifically about Jesus Christ. And then also these little pockets of influence that he established all over that region. And Titus was one of Paul's proteges, one of Paul's followers, someone who traveled with Paul. He did a lot. He's kind of like, one of Paul's kind of executive assistants. He would take money to churches to help distribute the funds. He would oversee certain things. They heard all kinds of conversations. I can imagine Titus and Paul sitting there as Paul is kind of wrestling with how he's going to write this to the Romans. How's he going to explain this to a Jewish audience and a Gentile audience or a Greek audience all in the same room, right? How's he going to talk to them? How's he going to say this to them? What's he going to write when he tries to wrestle out this issue or this question that he came from Corinth? And how's he going to address this particular scenario when these people couldn't get along with these people? And Timothy was there too, but Titus probably heard Paul processing this. I don't think Paul went away in a room and just thought about it for a little while and then wrote this down and then mailed it. That's not how it worked. There was conversation. That was a very conversational culture they lived in. That's how they processed things. And so Paul writes this letter to Titus. He's on Crete, and he says, Titus, I'm going to leave you on Crete because there's a work that needs to be done. There's some unfinished business that needs to occur on this island. And this island was kind of right in the middle of the ocean, south of Greece, of the mainland. And so there was a strategic center for military bases, but there was a lot of sort of cultural status quo where there was a power structure in play. Individualism was kind of rampant to the point that people weren't getting married. They weren't really having kids. They were just sort of, we just need to take care of ourselves and we'll all be good. This is the life that we built here on this island in this beautiful place called Crete. So Titus gets this letter from Paul, and he says, Titus, I want you to make sure that I'm writing you so that you further the faith. I want for you to be a part of making sure that God's people, followers of Jesus, become more faithful. Become more faithful. And he also says, this is all in Titus 1, the very beginning. He also says, I want you to grow in the knowledge of the truth that leads specifically to godliness. This is how I write it in my journal. I just make notes. So he wants to further faith. It's not a system of beliefs. It's an activity in which we trust God. So make sure you get that in your mind. When he says to further the faith, it's not about you need to know more facts and how to defend, some issue that your friends are yelling at you about, or to defend your political positions. It's to further your dependency and your trust in God himself and in Jesus and your relationship with him and what he's calling you to do. And then he says, I want you to develop a knowledge of truth, not so that you can understand and prove people wrong, but it actually develops or emerges as godliness. Godliness is sort of the shape. It's where your life looks like the image of God. It's like where you look like the picture on the box that you were intended to be when you were created. So that somehow these two things, this knowledge, this understanding of this, produces in you the shape of God, the image of God in the world in which you exist and live. And so that's how we get this writing. And I want us to read this, and I want to talk about how we read this, how we understand this. And again, this is the verses that I'm going to read you today are among the ones that have been most abused for both minorities and have created racial discord in the history of our country. Also to belittle or to sort of keep women, quote, in their place. And I say that because that's true. People have used the Bible in ways that God never intended. Y'all know that, right? That's why I'm reading this, because when you read this, if you're not careful, you'll see some things. I got to wear my glasses. It's like happening. I've tried. Last week I was like doing this. I'm like, maybe I can read it from here. And so I'm just going to break down and wear my glasses. Now I can't see any of you. Oh, dude. All right, here we go. Titus chapter 2. So I ask you to read this and just observe what you think, what you see. And the thing is, when you're reading this, right, the Protestant Reformation, they printed the Bible and gave it to everybody. It used to be only the professional people could read it and then tell you what the Bible says. And now you just get it in your hands and it's on your phone and you read it and go, what do I make of this? And I think the reason is because we're supposed to read this together and process this together and think about this together and ask questions together and then trust the Holy Spirit to lead us in the way in which he intends for his people to live. So I just said read it and mark some stuff down, so I'll read it and then I will mark some stuff down. You, however, he's talking to Titus, teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, and sound in faith, in love and endurance. Does anybody see a list? She's like, hey, if I'm an older man, I'm going to write down being faithful, being temperate, being respectable. I'm going to write these things down. Likewise, teach the older women. I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, right? You're like, I'm an older woman. Teach the older women to be reverent in the way that they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to too much wine, but rather to teach what is good. So there's another list. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and their children, which I'm not really sure why you'd have to, but anyway, you get the idea. They would urge the younger women to love their husbands and children and to be self-controlled and pure and to be busy at home. This verse has been used to make sure that women's place is in the home kind of thing, to make sure they see the Bible says this is the word of God, and to be subject to their husbands and to be kind so that no one will malign the word of God. Similarly, encourage the young man to be self-controlled. I love this. Everybody else gets a list. Young men, just one thing, just control yourselves. That's all he says. If you can do that, you're good. We're getting some good lists here. I like this because I'm young and I just have one thing to remember. Everybody else has a lot of things to remember. Then he goes back to Titus, hey, in everything, I want you to be an example by doing what is good in your teaching, in your message, in your voice. Show integrity and seriousness and soundness of speech. Make sure it has gravity and weight and something that people can depend on and trust in. So that your speech cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they don't have anything bad to say about us. That they can't say, well, you are a fraud, or you are untrustworthy, or you are this. They don't have that license to throw those arrows. And then verse 9, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them and not to talk back to them and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about our God and Savior attractive. For the grace of God offers salvation to all people, and it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled and upright and godly in this present age, that we can actually become like this. So my question is, if you read that as a list and you try to apply that to your life, what do you get? What if you you're a young married woman with kids? What do you get if you're a young unmarried woman, right? You get left out. What if you're divorced? What if this? All these things come into play. Slavery's been abolished for a long time. So how do we apply this? These verses were used, when you read them like a list, they were used, especially in the 1800s, to justify slavery. Pastors stood in churches and used the Bible to justify owning people. And so we know it's not that. We know it's not that. So if it's not that, then what is it? How do we read this? How do we enter into this and understand this? So I want to kind of show you from my perspective what I think. And the very first thing he says is you got to pay attention to this thing he calls sound doctrine. Now, most all of us, if you've grown up in the church, have heard about this. And sound doctrine usually looks like this. It looks like a list of all the things that if you believe correctly about them, you are sound in your faith. And that's what furthering the faith often looks like. Now, my question is, it's not mentioned, there is no list of sound doctrine in the Bible. There's actually multiple places where it's listed out. So how do we process this? How do we understand this? What I want for you to understand as we kind of look into this and sort of the groundwork or the foundation is that I don't think he's advocating sound doctrine for the followers of Jesus so that you can say, I'm right. He's not going, hey, get your list and then you can yell and argue with everybody else about why they're wrong and you're right. That's not the purpose of sound doctrine, although that's kind of the way sound doctrine is often used in a lot of circles. And so what I begin to do is kind of noodle on this. What is it? Sound doctrine literally means healthy teaching or healthy thinking or healthy message. It's the same thing he was talking about when he talked about Timothy. Pay attention to your speaking, to your preaching. You'll see this down there about the teaching of God's word. It's the voice, it's the message. And what I want you to understand when you think about this, when you think about doctrine, when you think about this message, it's what you say. It's what you say with your life. It's your voice. When I say you find your voice, you said, hey, I found my voice. You don't mean I learned how to talk, right? You mean that you found out what you want to say. You found out this is what I say to the world. And what we have the opportunity to do, the voice of our church, the voice of the followers of Jesus that are gathered as a part of our fellowship is what we say to the world around us on behalf of God. And that your voice becomes our voice. What you do becomes what we do. That's the picture here. That's the idea. And it needs to be healthy. It needs to be full. It needs to be whole. It's not just a list of things. Is a list of things that you believe and how you understand issues important? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Those are great conversations. Those are great pursuits. You should have understanding of those things. We can talk about those later, but I don't think this is the foundation that Paul is driving at to do what needs to be done on this island of Crete. So what is this? If it's not a list, what is it? Well, I think what it is, I think what he's driving at, the reason he says you got to emphasize sound doctrine, doctrine does a couple things. Number one is it is always to foster the intimate work of God deep within your heart, not to prove that you're right on an issue. The first thing about God's teaching, the voice, the message of the cross, the message of the gospel, the message of God to you and to me is first and foremost to foster the intimate work of his gentle hands forming your heart in the deepest places. This is why authenticity is important. This is why honesty is important. This is why coming to him just as you are is so important. And number two, the teaching, the message, the voice is always to draw you into a relationship with him that brings wholeness to your soul. I want you to understand something. I haven't fleshed this out yet. I'm working on this for something later on. But my premise, I believe this. I believe that, and especially in the next generation, the fact that our culture is plagued with anxiety over almost everything, the fact that we are plagued with so many all this sort of disruption in our mental space. It's not just emotional or mental, it's also spiritual. There's a spiritual component to it, and there's a physical component to it. But I think the fundamental, if you drive it back to the very beginning, I think what you'll see what's what God elevates and says. He says things like, you were made for God. By all things you were created. He created all things for him and by him. That includes you. The body is not meant to be given in all these different ways that our culture says, but rather it's for the Lord. It always talks about wholeness and wholeheartedness and this idea of fullness in who we are. And it's the idea of integrity that when we learn how to live whole, right? We learn how to live whole. It's the duplicity, the being pulled, and all the things that creates the space for all these other things to happen. When we learn how to live wholly and fully, it creates a much more difficult place for those kinds of things to grow and to flourish. So he calls us into these things, and I'll show you how he sets this up in just a minute. Last week, I told you, I think it's worth mentioning because he said there's an unfinished business that you're to finish, and you want to set in order this thing. And what a lot of people do, especially Americans, myself included, I've done this, is I get really focused on the order. I like organizations. I like organizational thought. I like organizational, structure and health. I love tinkering with things. I love the fact that I get to be a part of a big, giant team that leads this church. It's a lot of fun in that. So I love that. But order is not primary. It's the unfinished business. It's the business that the order serves. And so what I would suggest is, I just said, what is the business and what is the business? And the business is the business of the gospel, of a gospel presence that affects the culture. The business that we are to be about is the business of a gospel presence, of being a people of God that represent the way of Jesus that actually impacts or affects the culture. What a lot of people do, what a lot of effort is spent on, I've had this conversation over and over and over and over again, especially in this political season, with people trying to figure out which party is going to finally solve the problem. I just go, neither of them. Neither of them. It is not going to happen. It's not. We all have our list, right? If we just did this, we would solve the problem. What if God's intention for his people is not to solve the problem, but to navigate it in a way that lets him be seen? How different would that be? Do you know how freeing that is? It doesn't mean that we're not working for solutions, but what I believe the message of the Bible isn't about solving problems, it's about the redemption of purpose, and those are two very different things. Solving problems, right? When I talked about this in the video on Sunday, I said that God calls us he's called to bring healing, right? There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, and it heals everything it touches. There's this healing power of God's Spirit and his movement in this world. But healing, the way you think about healing is like, if I break my leg, it heals so I can get back to doing what I was doing. Like my wife, right? She's recovering from surgery. She went in to heal so she can go back and do what she wants. That's not the biblical concept of healing. The biblical concept of healing is restoring to wholeness. It's justice, it's redemption, it's shalom. It's that thing that gets righted finally and fully forever. So this is the picture that I want us to have in our head. So the business of the gospel presence that affects our culture. And number two is God's grace is the source of this countercultural influence. It is not your ability to argue or prove your point or be better than everybody. It is God's grace that teaches us how to navigate and live in this world. And we have got to learn how to further our faith so that we are so utterly dependent on it and so unbelievably shrewd in our discernment of it. I've been saying this a lot over and over. It's one of my favorite statements that Jesus says. I think it's so perfect for our culture. He says, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. So go kill all the wolves. Put them in their place. No, he says, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. Be shrewd as a serpent. I love that. Put your mind to work. Use your imagination. Look and see and think. And sniff out things. Look and see where you can bring this subtle influence to make a difference. How do we do this? God's grace is the source of this. And so I think that the unfinished business is more important than the order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of tell you why, and I'm going to tell you why I think Paul gave us this specific list in Titus 2 about older men, older women, younger women, family, and slaves. And I'm going to tell you why I think he gave us that list. So the way I want to do that is I want to back up to Titus chapter 1 and then read this in context. And he says, the reason I left you in Crete, Titus, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order, it says Titus chapter 1 verse 5, that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Now let me tell you, as a young pastor, almost 21 years ago, we were getting ready to put this church together to figure out what it looked like to start a church. When I read, I want you to set this in order and here's how you do it. Let me tell you, I got my pen and my paper out and I began to make a list. You know why? Because I needed to know how to set in order what God had asked me to do. And then he gives me a list of the kind of people I'm looking for. And he talks about being faithful in your marriage, specifically a husband to one wife, which brings up a whole bunch of questions, I know. He talks about being blameless. He talks about being faithful. He talks about managing your household well. And when we started the church, I had one daughter. A year and a half into the church, I had two daughters. And you don't think there's pressure to manage your household well when you were outnumbered 3-1? That's what he says. If you don't know how to manage your household well, how can you manage God's household? So I told my kids, I said, you got to behave or else I'm going to lose my job. I didn't tell them that, but that's what it feels like because it's a list. So what is he saying? Because see, I love this when I'm trying to put together an organization. I got to have this check mark and this check mark and this check mark and this check mark. It also says not someone who's given to drunkenness. That's kind of a good thing. It'd be a bad idea for me to be up here drunk every week telling you stuff. Might be fun or funny, but it would be not a great strategy. People always ask me, I personally do not drink alcohol, and it's not because I don't believe the Bible, it's not because I believe the Bible teaches against it. It's just because I got enough issues and I don't need to contribute any more to it. So, but it says don't be given to drunkenness. Don't be quick-tempered. Don't be violent. Don't use people and your position for your own gain. You start to see this list as like, could you get behind that? Could you get someone who is in, and the thing that I learned about my family is it wasn't so much I need to keep them under control so I keep my job. That was impossible. It was to recognize that, hey, I'm authentic in the most intimate relationships that I have. And my daughter's actually sitting down here and one of them's here somewhere else. And you can ask them, I'm pretty much like this all the time. Like all the nuttiness you see up here, it's the same thing in the house. And the reason is because this isn't my primary place. That is, and everything else is an expression. And I think that's what he's driving at. You've got to be authentic in your relationships and don't try to grab onto other things. Or else you'll end up using people for those things. Am I right? Okay, she's just saying yes. Let's make sure she agrees. If you don't, I'll lose my job. So he gives us this list. So as a Western checklist person, you then create this list and you start finding people who match this list, and then you put together your organization. The order then becomes more important in the business. And I've never read this kind of in its fullness, but when you read it like this, it says, hey, Titus, I want you to set in order right? By appointing elders, unfinished business, you need to find some people who have integrity, who are trustworthy, who represent things well, who are who they say they are. You need to represent some people who are going to be steady and stable and an influence. And then he says, for there are many, look at this verse 10, for there are many knuckleheads. You got to pick some good people, because there's a lot of knuckleheads. That's what he says. It's not so much about here's your list to get this order right. He's like, there's a lot of people who are going to want a lot of things, and I want you to set this in order, and you need to find some people who are like this, because there are many who are rebellious people, full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group, especially those who are in charge of most of the religious efforts that are happening right now. They are manipulating and they are oppressing people to keep and preserve their power. They must be silenced because they are disrupting, note this, the whole households. He connects it back to this sort of, they're disrupting families. They're disrupting households by teaching things, by this voice and message that they're giving. They're disrupting entire households by teaching things they ought not to teach. And for the sake of dishonest gain, they're doing it to build their platform or to exploit the congregation or whatever it is they're doing. And then he says this, that one of Crete's own prophets, I think this is awesome. One of Crete's own prophets, this will be like Taylor Swift, like quoting a Taylor Swift lyric. Like, oh, Taylor Swift said this about our country or about our culture. And you would use, see, one of your own pop culture icons said this. And that's what he says. One of Crete's own prophets has written and said, Cretans are always liars and evil brutes and lazy gluttons. That's a pretty indicting thing to say. And he says, this saying is actually true. Therefore rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in their faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or merely human commands of those who reject the truth. To the pure, all things are pure. I'm going to talk more about this in a teaching at some point later on, because I don't have time to get into it today. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and their consciences are corrupted. Purity isn't you believing everything right or behaving perfectly. When Jesus talked about being clean, he talked about being clean because of the word that I've already spoken to you, to Peter in John 13. He will talk about this later on in Titus when he says that Jesus Christ himself will purify us. That to the pure, all things are pure. To those who believe and trust, we begin to see things a little differently. But to those who are already corrupted and do not believe, they are always looking for an angle and they'll never find the truth. They're always looking to perpetuate their way. That's what it's talking about. They claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. Then he gives us a list. They're detestable, they're disobedient, and they're unfit for doing anything good. Does anybody know anybody like that? I'm just kidding, don't say that. For some of you, you're like, yeah, man, silence them. Yeah, rebuke them sharply. You're like, I'm going to apply God's word today. And you're going to start tweeting and Facebooking and whatever else you're doing, TikToking, and you're going to let everybody have it. And if someone says something that they shouldn't have said, we just cancel them. Here's what I'm doing. I think there's a validity to making sure that people don't continue to harm other people with positions and things that are harmful. He says you're using your influence and you're leading whole households astray. And like you can say, well, Mike, I think you ought to stand up for the issues more. You ought to tell us this, and you can make a case for that. But you know what I'm going to say? I always want to know a name. We can talk about an issue, I want to know a name. And my posture for the last 10, 11, 12 years has been when I have an issue or someone, I know enough people, I make a phone call, I have a conversation. I listen, I lean in, I try to understand. I want to be wise as a serpent. And I want to be shrewd as a serpent in these moments. Because the influence that we've been given needs to be leveraged ever so carefully so that no one can say about us, oh, that big church or that church, they only do this or they, no. We live differently. We live differently. We don't have a political agenda. We have a kingdom agenda. I've had conversations with a lot of different people. I've mentioned individualism we have to watch out for. And then usually the thing is, well, collectivism is a bad idea too. And it's like these two political systems. And here's the problem with them. Individualism says that individual rights are the highest value. That's a great American value, and it's an important part, and it should be a part of it. The individual rights are the highest value. Collectivism says that the good of the whole is the highest value. And Jesus comes along and says, no, actually, I'm the highest value. And when you get that right, everything else falls into place. When he says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, that's what he means. It's when you and I bow a knee to the King, we're willing to do what he asks of us in all these different areas. So what I think he's saying here in this whole passage is basically this. Pay attention to who you trust. You will leverage the influence that you receive. We were having this conversation back in the hall after the first service. This isn't the same as garbage in and garbage out. Garbage in and garbage out is whatever information goes into your brain will become the information by which you measure things. This is the measure in which you are influenced will become the way you leverage influence in your life. The things that influence you will be the things and the ways that you influence other people. This is about how you feel and respond and react and move, because we are called to operate by a different principle. We are under a rule of God's love. And you've got to think about what influences you. Right? Everybody here knows you can get up tomorrow morning or tonight or whatever it is, and you can turn on Fox News. You're going to be like, yeah, or you're going to be like, no. Or you can turn on MSNBC and you're going to be like, yeah, or you're going to be like, no. And you can get yourself all worked up just like that, right? You can get on Facebook or Instagram, or you can get yourself, it's not hard to get ourselves worked up, right? I assume you know that. There's a different way. What is it that influences you? What if it were your relationship with Christ, your part in his community? Right, that his rule and his reign were the primary influence in your life. And that became the primary thing that you leveraged as you leverage your influence for other people. I can't answer for everybody. I have to answer for myself. We as a church, as a staff, the currency is trust. The currency is a steady voice. The currency is helping people walk with God. The currency is we are going to be here for the long haul. We've been in this for 21 years. We're going to continue to do this into the future. And my point is that what you and I have to do is we have to be so mindful of where we place our trust and how we leverage what God is doing in and through our church for the generations to come. So that brings me to kind of the way I want to close our time together. Then we're going to kind of do a blessing over everybody, I think, to that end. I think that Paul's concern in this letter is the spread of the gospel. Certainly. A lot of us who've grown up in the church, the spread of the gospel meant go tell them as many people that you can, get them to raise their hand and pray a prayer so they'll go to heaven when they die. I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. Is that a true thing? Yes, it's a true thing. I think it's short-sighted. Jesus said, you're proclaiming the kingdom of God is here. Paul said that you have a grace that helps you right here in this present age for the unfinished business that lies here. And I think what it is that Paul's concern is for the spread of the gospel and this is what I would write down, the impact of the gospel on the culture. And the impact of the gospel on the culture. Do you know what that is? Do we know what redemption looks like? Where there's no solutions. Do we know what navigating chaos looks like where a solution isn't likely? I think Paul writes this. He writes to younger women, hey, be cool with your husbands and be cool with your kids, because there was this power struggle going on. There was the women, they'd long been treated as property, and now a lot of these women had access to wealth or to options. So they basically would say, see you later. You've treated me bad for this long. See you later. I'm not going to live under your way anymore. I'm doing my own thing. And everything they did, if they stayed at home, they seemed to be proving a point that they weren't sufficient enough or independent enough. And so to move and to do something else meant they were independent, kind of, raise your fist and stick it to the man kind of thing. And the same was true with the slaves. It wasn't to advocate slavery the way we know it in America. It was really an economic system, and I don't have time to get into all that, but there was a lot of slave revolts. There was just wreaking continued havoc in there. And he said, y'all, there's a different way to live. There's a way to live. It doesn't mean that you don't stand up. It doesn't mean that you don't work for good or even cause havoc when you need to. It just means you don't create to the cultural chaos that everybody else is creating to. We do this differently. So he gives us this list, and the reason is because I think, number one, I think he's telling us that everything isn't a struggle for power, everything isn't a violation of your rights, and everything isn't your need to prove a point. Everything that you do doesn't prove a point. If you wear a mask, it doesn't mean you're a Democrat or I can't remember which it is, but if you do this, it doesn't mean that. If you do this, it doesn't mean that. Everything isn't a point. If you love your wives like Christ at the church, if you submit to your husbands, it doesn't mean any other things. If you are content in your place, in your way, it doesn't mean that you're not ambitious or don't have dreams. It just means this is what you're doing right here in front of you. If I don't stand up and grandstand on a particular issue, it doesn't mean they don't have conversations about it. It just means I'm not grandstanding because I'm doing something different. There's a way that God has called me to live. The way of life under the rule of God's love. It's different. Because what I do becomes what we do, and what you do becomes what we do. There's a second reason that Paul, I think, is emphasizing, and it's the reason for Titus, it's the reason for staying in a place, it's the reason for talking about children and families and what was getting wrecked in the disruption of that. It was because the stakes of our faithfulness are actually measured in the next generation. I'm so glad to see a lot of our college students here this morning because the stakes of what we do are going to be measured in what you guys do from here on out. If you read the Bible with any kind of lens, you'll notice this. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, when Moses got the elders together and he said, I want you to teach your children the commands that God has taught you so that your children's children will know that I am God. The whole purpose wasn't so that you'll live long and prosper in the promised land. You're not even going to see it, but so that your children's children will know that I'm God. I have often in my house, I have a statement that just says, the purpose of the family is for your children's children to know God is God. And the church isn't just, what's happened is the church has become a people of God, to become a family of God, that we are that. And the purpose of our church is that the generations two down will worship and know God the way that we know Him. What we do becomes what they do. When in Joshua chapter 3, he says, hey, I've led you through the Jordan River. I want to get some rocks out of the middle of the river and want you to set them up. So you guys can write songs and have campfires and go, woohoo, look what God did. No, he said, so when your children ask, you'll be able to tell them. This is all through the Bible. Psalm chapter 78. He says, I want you to teach these things. I want this message to be clear so the next generation would know them, even children that are yet to be born, and they would in turn tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God. They would not forget His commands. Psalm 102, verse 18. Let this be written for a future generation of people that are not yet created, that they may praise the Lord. Let the things that we do cause generations from now to raise their hands and their voices and say, He is God. What I'm so excited about, this past week in Port City, we had a lunch, I think Wednesday or Tuesday, I'm not sure what day it was. There were 29 college students that are interns here at our church, serving all throughout our church. Production, they're serving on host team, they're serving with our care department. 4 of them are actually assigned today, or 7 of them are actually assigned today, working this service or this morning. 4 of them for the first time. Sam and Katie and Kelsey and Michaela are all first time today. Jacob and Lillian and Jessica in our production have been doing this for a while. But all these college students that are serving in our church, and I think probably all 29 of them are here this morning, or a lot of you guys are. And it just makes me excited. The 2 guys who are helping us backstage, CJ and Jacob, are also high school students. And you begin to see them taking responsibility and being a part. You see, being a part of this is an individual responsibility, but it's a corporate opportunity. I don't know if you realize this or not, there's a lot of talk about college students in our culture, about how irresponsible they are. Go to all these parties at UNC, Chapel Hill, and get the whole thing closed down. You can make a case it was Chapel Hill. So I'm just kidding. But there's all this talk about the parties and the irresponsibility, and then there's and it's all over. Notre Dame, it's all over the place. You realize our college students are leading us in how to regather. Tuesday night, they put 280 students in this room, college students, Every one of them walked through those doors with a reservation. Every one of them had their temperature checked. Every one of them had a mask. Every one of them remained socially distanced as they gathered. They're showing us how this can be done amid all the chaos that is happening in our culture. You want to know how to contribute to healing? You just do things that contribute to the healing. That's what I'm talking about. So thank you guys for your willingness to be a part and to help lead our church and be a model for what really everybody should be trying to figure out how to do together instead of barking about it. Anyway, I don't have time to get into that. So I want to close because I think there is, as you and I begin to really step in and take responsibility. One thing I've said, I'll tell you, the reason I don't have a lot of stock in I don't want to say it like this, just in the current systems, is because the current systems operate by everyone avoiding responsibility. No one being willing to take responsibility for the decisions they're making. What I'm telling you that we are going to do as followers of Jesus, we're going to make decisions and we're going to be responsible for them. Every step of the way. They're going to be intentional, they're going to be shrewd, and we're going to make decisions, but we're going to be responsible for them because there's an individual responsibility required of us, but it's a corporate opportunity to be a light and to bring healing into a chaotic world. And that makes me excited. It is not going to be easy. It is not going to be without pain. It is not going to be without disruption, which is why I want to pray this blessing over you. A blessing is not a guarantee of prosperity, but what it is an assurance of God's faithfulness and his purpose, that it will be accomplished. Redemption is a guarantee, and we get to work for that. And it just says this: may the Lord bless you, and may the Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you, right? May you see his face, and may he be gracious to you. May you experience his grace in a way that teaches you to say no to ungodliness and to live self-controlled and upright and in the shape of his image right here in this present age for the sake of what he wants to do in this generation and the generations to come. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Father, I thank you that you have made a way, not just given us a checklist. You've made a way that requires us to trust and to walk and to learn and to grow and to struggle and to chase. It requires sometimes things to be pried from our fingers. They can be brought into your redemptive purpose and plan. So God, I just ask that you would bless our congregation, all those who are here, all those who are in the sound of my voice as we lift this, that you would be the source. You would keep us. Your face would be before us, and that your peace would be with us. And we would find your grace to be oh so sufficient for us. So Father, I lift all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King.